everybody. This is Narrative Dissonance on Unsafe Space. And we just lost my face on the screen.
Juliet just disappeared.
I don't know. Well, I don't have a hiss in my mic, though. Let me see if I can fix
We can hear you anyway.
Well, good. Okay. Carter, do you want to take the intro while I figure this out?
Sure. You're watching Narrative Dissonance on Unsafe Space. This is a show that airs every Monday at 2 p.m. Pacific, in which we question mainstream narratives and, generally talk about things that I was going to say Brian Stelter wouldn't, but he wouldn't talk about anything. I think he got fired or left or something. I don't know. Things that Don Lemon wouldn't talk about. Anyway, you can watch us on YouTube as long as we are surviving here. We're also on Rumble. We're starting to build our Rumble channel up a little bit. And also Odyssey, Utreon, and we have a live stream embedded on our website. So welcome. If you're new, you can follow us on Twitter at _unsafespace. That is the resurrected Twitter account. We've been banned like every good Twitter user. We went through our ban. What else? Am I forgetting anything, Juliet?
No. Book club? This coming up.
Oh.
We had book club yesterday. And then the next one is October 30th, and we're doing Slaughterhouse 5.
Yep, and Juliet is the host for Slaughterhouse 5. I think yesterday, people were just afraid of this book. I don't know what it was. It was I thought it was a good book to read. It was The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. But sometimes people like the easier to read stuff, and that was not an easy book. I think Slaughterhouse 5 is going to be easy and fun, and I don't know anything about it. Okay. But I assume it sounds like it's a good Halloween book, right? No?
We might trick people into reading it thinking that.
It's not actually. Oh, damn it. It sounds like, there's going to be axe murdering and stuff in it. But,
right.
Okay, fair enough. Let's dive into the show then today without further ado. Today we're very happy to welcome back to the show a panelist who's been here before, Brian McGlinchey. Brian is an independent journalist whose work has been credited by the New York Times, Associated Press, Times of London, and others. His Substack newsletter, Stark Realities with Brian McGlinchey, undermines official narratives. Hey, I like that. Demolishes conventional wisdom and exposes fundamental myths across the political spectrum. And you can go to starkrealities.substack.com to sign up. I really like it, so I do recommend that you read it. It's easy to read. It's well-researched. He's always bringing in stuff that... when they cherry pick data, he goes and grabs the pits and throws them out in front of you for you to read. So, welcome, Brian.
Hey, great to be back with you, and good to meet you, Juliet.
Yes.
So, you've been on the show before, so you know how we typically start the show off. So, I'll just open with our standard question: what's the most important story about which mainstream media has misled people in the last week, months, whatever, recent history?
Misled. With this past week, we had the news that Vladimir Putin had granted citizenship to Edward Snowden, the famed NSA whistleblower, and that prompted a whole reiteration of kind of a myth that goes even across the political spectrum, which people, when they're talking about the circumstances that led Snowden to end up in Russia, you always hear them say that he fled to Russia after revealing all the secrets of the deep state and that massive, unconstitutional, illegal mass surveillance program that was going on. And still is to some extent, of course. That's false. What people don't realize is that Snowden wasn't. He didn't flee to Moscow. He was just simply traveling through Moscow. You'll recall he went to Hong Kong, where he met with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, two journalists working for The Guardian, and passed along all the 200,000 files of NSA files. And then he was next trying to get to Ecuador, following Julian Assange's steps in a different way. Assange was spent many years in exile in the Ecuadorian consulate in London. Similarly, Snowden had hopes that Ecuador would grant him political asylum, and so he's trying to travel to Ecuador. And in doing so, he had to be very careful about his flight path. and his connections. So he went through. He was scheduled to go through Moscow, then on to Havana, Caracas, Venezuela, and then finally Quito, Ecuador. Why is he in Russia? Because the Obama administration canceled his passport while he was in the air heading to Russia. So they, in effect, trapped him in Russia, which in doing so, they undermined their own narratives, right? Here we have this dangerous traitor to the country who had absconded with all these files, not out of patriotism, but out of self-interest or what have you, or egotism, all the things they kind of threw at him, or that it was for money, and that he fled to Russia. Well, absolutely not the case. And if that had been true, that was their profile of this individual, why on earth would they yank his passport and say, "Aha, you're trapped in Russia, our major adversary," right? It just didn't make any sense. But it doesn't. Kind of underscores that narratives don't even have to make sense.
Yeah.
For them to be effective and gain traction. It's been 9 years, I guess, since he's been, since that whole episode happened. And you still see people on Twitter. You still saw in the past week, as they were reporting on the grant of citizenship to Snowden by Russia. You saw New York Times, even The Guardian, which was one of the initial publications that helped publish the secrets that were revealed. Even they had a headline talking about, referring to the fact that he had fled to Russia. So these things just have traction.
I mean, that framing is important, right? Because fleeing, there's that kind of concept. If you flee the scene of a crime, you're by implication, there's this guilt by implication that people assume. Well, if it was an accident, why did you flee? Right. Or if you're innocent, why did you run? And so that just using that language, like he fleeing to Russia. Absolutely. You're right. Doubles down on this narrative of like, oh, he wanted to go hand some intel to Putin, right, as if that was his plan at all. And I don't think people understand when you're in that circumstance. Like you said, you couldn't even fly over airspace that was U.S. airspace. So he had to take a very circuitous route to try and get, I think Havana was one of the stops that he was going to make. And like, he was trying to get from basically Hong Kong to Ecuador without touching U.S. territory or flying over U.S. airspace. Right.
And he was taking even a risk, even with that itinerary, because he would have been flying over NATO airspace at one point. And you might remember around that time, I think it was Evo Morales, a South American leader, was he was in Moscow and was flying back home, and the U.S. actually orchestrated for this president of a country, his flight to be diverted, so his plane could be. I mean, it's a major violation of sovereignty because they suspected that Snowden was on the plane with him or hiding on it. So he was even taking a chance with the itinerary he had in mind.
Yeah. So he lands in Moscow expecting to do a connection. Actually, if anyone is interested, I think is it called Citizen 4? Do you know the documentary that's
Yeah, Citizen 4 is one of the documentaries. Yep.
Yeah. And there's footage from this, like there's a camera with him because Glenn Greenwald is with him part of the time, and then they hand off to some other people who can help him evade capture. And he lands in the airport, and it's like, well, you have no passport, and you don't think about that. But if you're stuck in a Russian airport with no passport, no other country will let you fly. You can't go anywhere.
Right. He was supposed to have a 23-hour layover in Moscow, and security quickly took him, Russian security, to a conference room, and they told him that his passport. They said, "Oh, you don't know." And they told him your passport canceled. Snowden thought they might have been bluffing because he's in his, he's had an intelligence career of his own of sorts, and so he thought that they might be bluffing and trying to get info out of him or work with them. He was accompanied by a WikiLeaks editor who had flown to Hong Kong and then was traveled with him, trying to help him navigate all these hurdles to get through that. and she's looking it up at the same time and says, she finds all the news reports that yes, the passport's been canceled. So,
and he I mean, according to Snowden, he destroyed his key material before he got on a plane, which is important to understand. I mean, I've read his book, and he comes across as a guy. Honestly, he comes across as a guy who's just trying to do the right thing.
Right.
He's definitely security conscious, and as someone who was in security for a while myself, like I would have absolutely, if I knew I was flying through countries that were hostile to the country that I was leaking information about, but I cared about the country, and I want, he was very careful with what he released. He didn't just release it willy-nilly. He was careful. He vetted the reporters that he released very specific information to. So he wasn't trying to just, give a data dump on everything the NSA does to everyone, right?
Right.
So
he'd selected those journalists with the idea that they would vet that material and be very responsible about applying proper journalistic standards and anticipate any potential actual real world harm that might come to people. And like you said, he's a very practiced and very diligent, and very much thought out caper, or what do you want to call it, that he put. Yeah. So knowing that he was going to be traveling to Russia, Havana, or just his whole mission was to let's get this in the hands of journalism and let journalism
take over,
perform that function for society that it should perform. Right. So that's kind of for him. It's kind of mission accomplished in Hong Kong once he handed that over to Greenwald. And so yes, he had no reason to bring that. It only make him more of a target. He was already feeling
There's a reason to not bring it. There's a reason to destroy the keys.
You can kill me you can kill me if you want, but I don't have it anymore. So it was not in his interest to even do that.
Yeah. So that makes perfect sense. He gets to Russia, and like you said, I wanted to just underscore this. This whole narrative is that he's working with Putin, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's like, if you're falsely accusing your spouse of cheating on you with someone else, it's like locking them in that other person's house. Like, well, I wasn't like, I was walking by, you shoved me in the door and locked it, and now you're like, see, he's in the house. It's like, that's not what was happening.
Right. And still, on Twitter, you see all these neocon types. They just continue to say, oh, Russian agent, and all this sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So correct me, I don't really understand how this works too much, but my assumption is he hasn't been able to leave Russia at all, even if there was a friendly country to go to, because he didn't have a passport. But now he should be able to, if he's got Russian citizenship, he should be able to travel on a Russian passport now.
That's a good point. That had not occurred to me. Yeah. Yeah. To my knowledge, he has not left Russia at all. He's done many conference appearances and that type of thing via video. But I didn't think about that this might be his opportunity to depart. But imagine him. He talk about bringing on the wrath of the entire intelligence complex and national security complex.
You don't want to. There's no worse enemy.
He might be hesitant to just go somewhere and go to.
That's true.
I'd
be hesitant to go to the supermarket in Moscow.
Right. Yeah. So let's see what he does with his newfound potential there.
And his girlfriend was then forced to move. Well, not forced, but she moved there.
Right.
I think they're married and have a kid now.
Two sons now.
Two kids.
Yeah.
So
that's another. People call him cowardly. What a cowardly act. For him to do it this way. It's like, really, we're talking about, he had this great 6-figure income. He's living in Hawaii with his girlfriend,
it's
he's a fitness instructor, he's got the whole, this life in Hawaii, and to give that up, and he didn't tell her when he was leaving,
to protect her.
Left, to protect her. Cowardly is not necessarily the word, which brings up another myth, if we could, is that in reporting on this and in chatter on this whole episode, people say, well, if it's cowardly, the Snowden, if he wanted to do things the right way, he would have turned that material over and then turned himself into the police and gone before a court and made his case of why he should do that. and that is a complete this is a complete mythological foundation, because what he's being charged with under is the Espionage Act of 1917, this arcane, outdated fossil of a law that's kind of applied in a whole new ways that were surely not anticipated at the time. I mean, espionage, when this law was crafted, I think, was about what you and I would think of it, a person on the street would think of it is, giving secrets to the enemy, not to Glenn Greenwald or the Guardian or the Washington Post, but giving it to the enemy so that they could use it to, sink our subs or ships or whatever. And under the Espionage Act, though, to get back to the point, there is no opportunity to make that defense. There's no opportunity whatsoever to defend yourself based on, well, I was a whistleblower. You're not allowed to make that assertion. You can't say this was the right thing for society. I exposed unconstitutional conduct at the highest levels of government, and this probably the most massive violation of the Constitution we've ever seen, if you think about it. None of that is permissible in an Espionage Act suit. It's just black and white. Did you or did you not transfer this top secret information to somebody who wasn't authorized for it? And we've seen what happened to predecessors of Snowden who attempted to use the legitimate channels of combating this type of misconduct. Where they're like Thomas Drake, Binney at the NSA. You had a number of figures who came before him, and I think were an inspiration to him. Who when they tried to use those avenues, they end up with a SWAT raid at their house, and then again facing a judicial system that doesn't allow them to make the case that what they did was for the good of the country and to expose wrongdoing. So he'd been able to witness and see, okay, that's what happens when you go that route. That's a dead end. The route I've got to go is through journalism and publicizing this facts and letting it go from there.
Yeah. I mean, let's also talk about one of the most depressing things about Snowden to me is the consequences. Not to him personally, which is also depressing. I mean, I feel bad for the guy. You think about, I think he was in his 20s, which I think he might have been early 30s, but I think he was
very
in his
young.
20s.
Yeah.
Like it's the beginning of your life. Like he hadn't started a family yet. His entire career's ahead of him. And the guy gives up. I mean, he can never come back to the United States. He can never come to many places. It's not like he can't go to most of Europe. Like he's given up so much for this. That's disturbing. But even more disturbing is when I look at what it was for, because you had James Clapper lie publicly about what the NSA was doing, and zero consequences. Nothing has happened, and as far as we know, nothing has changed. I mean, they may have said, "Well, don't worry, we'll fix it," but there's no transparency, so we have no idea.
Right. I think they have curtailed one of the programs, but that's one of the things that's always nagged at me is what you just said is, okay, you tell the ultra secretive national security apparatus to stop doing some behavior
that they weren't supposed to be doing in the first place, and we're lying about. Yeah,
lying to Congress. I mean, Congress is there for oversight, and like you said, one of the things that Snowden exposed was them lying to Congress. James Clapper, at the time the director of national intelligence, point blank asked by Senator Ron Wyden, does the NSA, capture data on millions of Americans? Because Wyden knew the answer.
Sure.
I don't know how it came to him, but he knew the answer, and so he thought, well, we'll put him on the spot and ask him there. And then Clapper said, no, they don't. And people had fun with the. It was like the worst poker player ever. If you watch the video clip, and I wrote on this topic this last week at starkrealities.substack.com, but the video is there of him lying, and he says, the question's asked. He says no, and he goes, not wittingly. He like does this poker tell where
we might
touching his face, and so. But and what happens to him? I mean, that's perjury. Not just perjury maybe to protect himself, but perjury to protect an enormous unconstitutional program, a mass violation of the Fourth Amendment, what happens to him? Nothing. Well, he doesn't even lose his job, much less be pursued on a perjury charge. And then the mainstream media continues to look at him as this. Oh, here's developments in Russia. Let's see what James Clapper has to say about it. And he's a paid consultant now for CNN. And that's the case of a lot of these alumni of the national security establishment. Is now they're on MSNBC or they're a paid consultant. Back in the earlier days of all this, you had the CIA kind of working indirectly with journalists to try to get their desired messaging out there, and now the middleman's out. You've got these alumni of the national security establishment, and it's kind of like once a Marine, always a Marine. I mean, I think for all these people, they're embedded with that whole community and boards of directors and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and they have a vested interest to not admit that anything's going wrong,
right?
Because it's their reputation,
right?
So
now so they've got this direct pulpit from which to say whatever they want, put this CIA talking points out directly and be revered as they're doing it by journalists who aren't prone to question. It's funny to watch the evolution of some of the journalism where what you would think was a left-leaning MSNBC, the way they fawn over the national security former heads and CIA directors, just kind of inconsistent with what you'd think would be previous ideals from the progressive community, to fawn over these people. Yeah.
Well, they've probably been. I mean, I'm not. This is probably not the entire story, but I mean, there have been decades of, like you mentioned, there was a much more subtle. Well, I won't say subtle, but behind the scenes movement to manipulate how the American public, or how these intelligence agencies were portrayed to the American public. And part of that has been, during my entire childhood, which is, I'm in my late 40s now, right? My entire childhood, every movie, every television show depicted the brave, heroic men and women of, if the CIA was involved, they were viewed as this heroic. There was a heroic mystique, and they were saviors of the country, stopping, bending the rules, like kind of the Jack Bauer 24 kind of thing, like bending the rules, but only because we were all going to die in a nuclear blast, and it's a good thing we have Jack Bauer, right? And that was true for the FBI, that was true for the CIA, it was true for any of and even the NSA was viewed as like a little bit of darker shade morally, but super necessary, and like all these really cool tools and good thing for the NSA. And so, if you're raised on that and you're a journalist in your 40s now, it's almost not anything that you would question. Like, of course, these are the heroes.
Right.
James Clapper, he runs the organization of heroes. Why would I say something to piss him off? Why would I be such a jerk to like ask hard questions of him or question his motives? Can't question their motives.
We want them on that wall. Right?
That's right.
That's right. And then hand in hand with that goes the whole access dynamic. If you report if they were, the people who do report negatively on them, they're not going to get that next interview. A confrontational interview of the CIA director, or whatever you want to, any one of these characters, and that's true, of other elements of government too. That if you want to have that continued access to your White House sources and all that type of stuff, well, you better not get too adversarial.
Right. You're not invited to the next press conference, and he won't sit down with you for the next one. Yeah. It's a real shame. And I forgot my train of thought. That's one of the things that really bothers. So let's contrast. Edward Snowden, were he to return to the United States, would face possible execution. I mean, there would be trials or whatever, but like Espionage Act is not, like, at least life in prison. He's hated enough that like his life hangs in the balance in a major way. So that's the guy who reported. on these things that the NSA was doing, which were unconstitutional. How many people have lost their jobs for doing the things that he reported that were unconstitutional? Is it a nice round number?
Yes. I doubt anyone. I mean, I'm not aware of anyone. If anyone did, it would be because they didn't catch him on the way out. But even that, I'm sure, hasn't happened. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, if it's kind of like if someone apologizes but their behavior doesn't change, like you don't really need, you shouldn't be taking that apology seriously. And I see this. Hey, well, first of all, James Clapper wasn't even really contrite, but even when there's like feigned contrition, like, oops, sorry about that. Well, oh, that was a mistake. We'll fix all that data collection we didn't mean to do. There's never any follow-up. There's no, like, no one ever says like, oh, so who was responsible? Give me the list of names and we are going to A, fire them, and B, perhaps prosecute them for misuse of resources. Like this is, if you were a soldier in the military and you picked up an M16 or MP5 or whatever they use now, and you just started mowing down citizens in the middle of Los Angeles, presumably you would get in trouble for that. This is worse. I mean, this is affecting all 331 million people. Who knows what the effect? I mean, you know, it's hard to say it's worse than murder, but I you know, from a long-term perspective of government power and the building the apparatus of the security state, this is worse.
Yeah, it's the same lack of consequences applies to almost everything. I mean, anytime the government missteps, does the wrong thing, or is grossly negligent, typically the only result of that is that same agency gets more power and a bigger budget.
Right.
We need more money to fix the problem.
Exactly. Oh, well, okay, we need to install a new security apparatus so that we can't have people sneaking out documents like Snowden did, you know, so we need a whole budget for that program.
As if that's the problem.
Right, exactly. Yeah. 9/11 is a colossal example of this. I mean, talk about a failure to the American people, and no one was punished, fired, anything. I mean, nobody lost their job over that. And, you know, an enormous expansion of power, you know, along the lines of what we're talking about here, mass surveillance, but also in budgets, a whole new departments created, Department of Homeland Security, with the biggest, most expensive headquarters ever built in federal government history. So that's kind of one of those integral parts of government, you know, is that you can only failure just brings rewards. You know, brings more power and a greater budget. We need more money to accomplish what you want, Congress. Okay, so
right.
Yeah.
Why is it that? I mean, maybe you don't know the answer to it, so this is a speculation question. But why is it that so many of the people that I would say are the renegade Republicans, not kind of the traditional ones, but even the Trump kind of Republicans, right? They're kind of the renegade populist Republicans who are seemingly willing to ruffle feathers and say nasty things about Washington in a way that traditional Republicans won't. Mm-hmm. Even they don't seem to be really interested in pardoning Snowden. Actually, any dismantling. I mean, Trump ran on this drain the swamp campaign, and yet the people who point out which parts of the swamp are most toxic and where you should drain first, he didn't bother to pardon. I mean, you can complain about, oh, he didn't do this because they were stopping him here and they were stopping this. He had 100% power to pardon Assange and Snowden if he wanted to.
Right.
Nothing.
I think we talk more broadly about the members of Congress that are more renegade and so forth. I think it comes down to a very rational fear of the national security establishment. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're able to. We've seen their technological capabilities. We've got the legacy of FBI Director Hoover, who had files on members of Congress, and he would summon a member of Congress to his office and say, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know, we were investigating something and we found out about your granddaughter's drug problem. I just want you to know we're going to keep that confidential. What that was, there was this obvious message there, like, hey, let's not mess with the FBI's budget requests or anything else, and we're going to be just fine. I mean, that actually went on. So I mean, you've got that legacy. I think it was Senator Chuck Schumer during the Trump administration who kind of let down that guard briefly. I think it was him who he was talking about Trump taking on the national security establishment. And he said something like, well, he's going to find out if you do that. You do it at your own peril. He kind of explicitly acknowledged that dynamic. Yep. So I think that's true of members of Congress. And, I had some hopes on the way out that Trump, having himself been a victim of misconduct by the national security establishment and wanting to oust him. You could say whether he should be president or not. It's one thing to have that discussion. It's another to talk about the way that the FBI and other parts of national security went after him, whatever their motives were. Even himself having been a victim, he thought, well, maybe he'll stick it to him on the way out, right? And pardon Assange or Snowden. Especially Assange. I mean, WikiLeaks was so big to him. Yeah. You remember him being controversial at the podium, saying, "Hey, yay, WikiLeaks, and bring it on! I hope WikiLeaks leaks some more stuff." And I think for him, might have been that. I think it was obviously out of self-interest. Trump's obviously a self-interested politician, like they all are. And I think on his way out, he was already anticipating a 2024 run. And so I think he said, well, I don't need to be picking fights with the intelligence community because I'm going to be back here and hopefully in 4 years or 3 years run a campaign and then maybe back in office. So I think self-interest drove him to not throw that dart at them that a lot of us.
Do you think he was already thinking of this? He was already.
I mean, I think that, yeah. I mean, even at the time, I think people were kind of pointing out, hey, he's eligible to run again. So, yeah.
I mean, it's the hope for the Trump presidency. I mean, I was never a huge avid. There's things I liked about Trump, and certainly I liked him better than Hillary Clinton, just because he wasn't part of the deep state apparatus already.
Right.
But any hope that I had, he kind of put the nail in the coffin when he left office, and I was hoping for Assange, Albright. Ross, and
Ulrich,
and Snowden.
Or,
Nothing.
Oh yeah, you talking about the Silk Road?
Yeah.
Is that who you? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted those 3 pardons, and I thought, well, look, as tough as his life has been, like I could imagine I would never want to be president, but I can imagine like being president, dealing with a bunch of crap, kind of a mess. It sucks. They're fighting against you. You're going through the COVID thing happens. It's a total mess. But at least on your way out, right? I mean, at least on your way out, you can go, well, look, there's some basic things I know. Pardon.
Right.
I'm done. Like, at least
and he did do a bunch of pardons, of other types, but not some that could have really bolstered the spirits of a lot of people, and
I think so.
And sent a shot across the bow of the intelligence community.
Yeah. Well, and I think it undermines his failure to do that. I think if he was thinking about 2024, I think his failure to do that undermines his drain the swamp message. He can't go back because he's lost all credibility. He could have said it if he had done that. He could have at least come back and said, "Look, I've been fighting. I was stopped and prevented from doing a bunch of stuff. But when I could fight, like the last thing I could do, at least was this. This is as much as I could do."
Right.
But
yeah.
Yeah,
I think for Snowden, our only hope is a pardon just seems unlikely because, whether it's the red team or blue team that controls the presidency, this dynamic keeps applying.
Yeah,
that's a real long shot. But another would be a plea deal, where he agreed. And he has communicated, I think, his willingness to do that. Hey, I don't know what he said, but yeah, I think he'd be willing to do maybe a year in prison or whatever it might be.
Just so that he can officially get his hand slapped and they can save some face
Right. And I guess he wouldn't be pleading guilty to. Well, I guess it'd just be something about turning over documents. Yep, that's what I did. I did it for the right reasons, and then the plea deal.
Yeah.
But I mean, talk about navigating that process and trusting the counterparty. If you're Snowden into negotiating that, yeah, come on back to.
Yeah, like you said, I don't know. Someone in chat said the CIA sent a clear message when they shot Kennedy in broad daylight in front of his wife and supporters. I don't know who shot Kennedy, so I'm gonna pretend that I don't want to get into the conspiracy theory part of it, but there's generally a sentiment that this is totally something they would do. They would totally murder you.
Well, if you read The Devil's Chessboard by Talbot, can't remember his first name. It's a big book, so if it's on your reading club, it might be like a 2-month thing.
Alex will pick it, I'm sure. What's it called? The Devil's
Chessboard, I think. It's about the CIA, and it kind of traces it from its early days.
David Talbot.
Okay. Thank you. And the Dulles brothers, one over state and the other over intelligence. And number one, it does lead you to think, yes, it's extremely plausible that the CIA could have had a hand in the Kennedy assassination and thus sent a cautionary message to every president who came afterward. To the commenter's point. But even that aside, reading that book, it really totally deprograms you from all the propaganda that you had mentioned earlier that we all grow up with, watching movies and all that kind of stuff and reading spy novels, that type of thing. And it really reinforces that the CIA has been sinister, absolutely sinister from day one. And I know Truman quickly came to wonder what he had created when he put, let that become a permanent fixture after World War II. I mean, when you read that book and you see the utter ruthlessness with which the CIA will put innocent individuals through. One of the early chapters, not to get into it too much, but they send somebody off on a kind of a bogus trip into Europe, knowing that they would be suspected of being a spy, and this person gets locked up and put into a frozen prison, and they don't care because it helped create the mischief that they wanted to create. So yeah, I do recommend that book, and it does. It does.
Yeah, that sounds. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I know the two books that I was thinking of, which are not directly about the CIA, but touch on the CIA, or at least America's involvement in some nefarious activity, are the Management of Savagery and Scott Horton's book. What's it called? Enough Already. Both of those talk about how the U.S. behaves around the world in clandestine manners, and we have to assume that the puppet masters behind that are often just members of the intelligence community doing things. I mean, we know they orchestrated the coup in Iran. We know they were involved in. They were likely involved in Ukraine, in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. They were involved in Libya. They're like involved in Syria. I mean, just and they trained Bin Laden, which it seems kind of a. I sometimes you used to try and say that in a more nuanced way because it seems outrageous to say, but no, they trained Bin Laden. Like it's no nuance is really required there. They trained Bin Laden. And granted, they didn't train him to attack America, but they certainly helped him. So.
Yeah, I mean, the War on Terror goes back to 1979, and it was the seeds were planted by the United States government. Again, not with 9/11 in mind. Let's create this, fertilize this toxic ideology, and turn it on the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Well, don't add water. It just and grew from there.
He created a monster, and now you're shocked that he's attacking you. When it's
and then the monster
pointed it at. Yeah.
Then the monster becomes the justification for your bigger budget, more power. And it's this treadmill that benefits them.
Yeah. And Juliet, unless you have any more on this topic, I want to switch to a different topic.
No, I was just gonna say it's funny. Earlier today I saw, oh gosh, I always blank on this guy's name. Former CIA director John Brennan was on CNN saying that the most likely suspect in the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage is Russia, and it was a lengthy segment. It was about 5 minutes long, and I mean, just the way that the anchor is nodding and he's just like, yeah, obviously they did it. It's like, here we go again. Like the intelligence community is pretty great at selling a narrative.
Yeah, before they would take a reporter out to lunch or something like that, buy them lunch and do all this kind of stuff. And now, they get to Brennan just gets to go right on mic up and collect a check to put that stuff out there without any credible, even devil's advocate kind of questions by the journalist. It's
exactly.
Just, here's your time to talk. Oh, okay. And it must be credible. Because CIA's never lied to us before.
Right. You guys are reminding me of a different way in which the right tends to look at. So a lot of people will talk about the Yuri Bezmenov videos from the 80s, right? Yuri Bezmenov was a former KGB officer. He defected, and he gave a lot of talks about how the KGB operated. And one of his main points was that it doesn't do the James Bond kind of stuff. They're predominantly focused on ideological subversion, and this is a way to basically sway opinions about things over time, and set get narratives moving, and construct frameworks, and like this is what most of their budget went to, which is this kind of I'll call it psychological warfare, but it's he called it ideological subversion, and a lot of conservatives nod their head and say, yes, it's just like what the left is doing, or the Soviet Union, we're dealing with remnants of that today, and look how we're under attack, and blah blah blah. Well, and they're also able to look into Russia and say, well, you can't trust the Russian people are getting bad information because it's this, it's the Russian security apparatus that's doing all this propaganda and blah blah blah. And then you say, okay, great, let's talk about America's intelligence agencies in America's state. It's like, oh no, I'm sure they have no idea about ideological subversion. That's not at all on there. It's 95% of Russia's security apparatus's budget, but it's completely not something that we have to worry about with our agencies at all.
Like, Carter, we're the good guys. What are you talking about? We would never do anything like that. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really good point, though. I brought that up recently in a conversation where they were like, well, you can't trust anything Russia says, because their media is propaganda. And I was like, seriously, at this point in time, we're pretending that ours isn't? The mainstream media is propaganda, government hand-fed propaganda straight to the masses. So, but it's just funny because I think a lot of people still have that attitude, like, oh, Russia's bad, and they're controlling everything that their population hears, but they don't realize we're kind of in the same boat here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just one more thing before I'm going to make an argument that I think it's worse here, and here's my argument. I don't know about Russia specifically, so I'm going to use China as an example. My wife is native-born Chinese. She spends a lot of time in China still. She has business in China. Obviously, free press is not in the vernacular in China, right? It's not part of the vocabulary, right? But you know what that means? Every semi-educated Chinese person in all of the major cities knows damn well they're being lied to. They don't trust anything that's being said because they know it's a lie, because they know they're not living under a free. There's no illusion about a free press. They're like, well, of course we can't say this. Oh, you can't say that on WeChat. Oh, of course they're going to take that article down. I mean, there's a whole culture of when an article is shared around on social media, if it's on the edge, everyone's like, we read it now because it's going to be down. We all know they're going to like, they all know. And I think knowing actually is better than the situation in which where we find ourselves, where we think that, oh, well, we have a free press. It's because now we're duped, and they're less duped than we are.
Right.
I would say.
Yeah, it's like truth in labeling or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
They know what the equation is over there, whereas people here, no matter how many times you take that, how many times I sound like George Bush that time when he said, "Fool me once, trick me." Do you ever see that video?
Yes, yeah. I forget exactly what he said, but
it must be because I'm in Texas.
Yeah,
fool me, you can't get fooled again. But it's like no matter how many times the American public sees that they've been lied to,
right?
It's always, and that's part of the equation. You wait until the truth comes out at a comfortable time distance later. A lot of the times, I mean, we still don't have the JFK files out. Whatever happened there.
Right.
Gulf of Tonkin or WMD, and there's always some time span that goes between them, such that people think, oh well, that kind of stuff used to happen. They don't realize it's always happening. And
that happened last week, but not this week.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
they lied over here, but there's no way they're lying about this. No
yeah, and actually, and they don't even have to change personnel. Right. Oh, I'm sure the NSA was horrible when Snowden released that, but it's different now. It's like it's the same people.
And for more on that, let's talk to James Clapper,
right, yeah, exactly.
former director of national intelligence. Yeah. And the neocons, the same thing. I mean, all these disastrous foreign policy interventions. And for more on what we should do in Syria, let's talk to Bill Kristol.
Right? Yeah.
It's just the same dynamic. These people, there's just no consequence.
Yeah. Someone else in chat said jokingly, I trust the Kiwi lady that said she's the one source for truthful information. I don't know if you saw, that's Jacinda Ardern, I think, from New Zealand. I don't know if you remember that clip that was going around, but that was her message during COVID. Like, only we have the truthful information.
She's a particularly dystopian figure in all this that we live with now, because of the delivery and the packaging. It comes in this gentle voice. Her delivery is such that like it's sinister inside, but it's wrapped up in the friendly woman next door kind of thing.
I think actually there's a lot of that. I think there's they seldom look and act like the failed German artist. Right, like they don't. That's not how they.
Or a Bond
That's not
villain.
how they behave.
Right.
Yeah, they look like sweet little nice people who just mean well, and they've got lots of platitudes. And by the way, here's some authoritarian.
You just stay in your bubbles with her accent.
Right,
it's just like that's all I have to, just
it's
stay
like
in
the
your
Mary
bubbles,
Poppins
citizen.
of dictatorship.
Right, exactly.
Here's a spoonful of sugar with your authoritarianism. And we go for it. We at least the New Zealanders did, I guess. I want to talk about actually an article that you wrote at the end of July, which I know is a couple months old, but it's something that I think you make a really great point about it, and this is about the fentanyl crisis. And a point that you make, it's a lot of a lot of us will argue against the drug war, and there's moral arguments. Government shouldn't be able to tell you what to put in your body, blah, blah, blah. That falls on deaf ears for a lot of people who are like, yeah, but heroin's bad or whatever. I still make the argument, but it doesn't always work. Then you can try and make an argument about the logistical failure of the drug war. Like, hey, we spent a lot of money. There's a lot of people in jail. It's gotten a lot worse. They haven't solved the problem. They can't even keep heroin out of prison. How are they going to keep it out of suburbs or whatever? Like, it's just, you can make those arguments. You bring up another argument that I think is the iron law of prohibition. When you talk about fentanyl, I'm wondering if you can tell people about this article and what your perspective on it is there.
Yeah. The title is, if I recall, is the fentanyl crisis, brought to you by drug prohibition.
Yes.
And basically just kind of laying out the fact that what we're seeing with fentanyl, which is god awful, overdose deaths en masse, it's a byproduct of the war on terror. I mean, excuse me, a related
possibly maybe a byproduct of that as well. Who knows?
Yeah, it's true. A related phony counterproductive war. It's a byproduct of the war on drugs. It's the solution isn't more war on drugs. It's actually less, and that's. And a lot of what I write about is trying to help people understand some things that are counterintuitive but are true, and that's the case here. Like you said, people think fentanyl's bad, so we have to make it illegal. Or heroin's bad. We've got to make it illegal and search people for it and all that kind of stuff, not realizing the consequence. And the iron law of prohibition suggests that the more you when you illegalize a substance, all you do is set forth into motion a set of incentives that leads the prohibited item, the nature of that prohibited item, to become more concentrated and more deadly and more portable. Because that's really what we're talking about, especially where drugs are concerned. So you ramp up the war on drugs such that you're able to really do more and more thorough searches of trucks at the border, or planes coming in, shipping containers, all that kind of stuff. What you're doing is incentivizing people to traffic in drugs that are much more concentrated, and thus can fit in a smaller container, and are thus more easily smugglable. And we've seen this play out. There's so many examples of it. Going back to alcohol prohibition, where if it's prohibited to produce and cart alcohol around, what do you incentivize to do? You're going to make the most concentrated type possible, grain alcohol or whatever, and that's what you're going to be transporting. And obviously, grain alcohol is more dangerous than a beer. Likewise, this is a great chart here, courtesy of, it's listed there. But so you see beer and wine, leads you to more concentrated things. Look at opium, rather just regular opium, then you go to heroin, and then from that you go to the fentanyl. Cocaine, powder is more easily transportable than the leaves and that type of stuff. And then, crack's even more concentrated than that. And so we see the same thing with fentanyl. So it's more deadly. So we can't judge policies by their intentions, no matter what type of public policy we're talking about. You have to judge it by the consequences. And that's what people fail to do. They think, like you said in your little example, people say drugs are bad, right? So they've got to be illegal. It's just people want to put that stamp on it. Like they see a law almost as standing up and making a societal statement about something. There's
a moral.
We're not for that. Yeah, exactly. Right. And but that's not how you have to judge policy. You have to judge it by the consequences. And the consequences of prohibition, whether it's alcohol or drugs or anything else, it leads to more harm than good. I mean, marijuana, nobody's ever overdosed from marijuana. How many people have died in the war on drugs, whether it's in violence between police and perpetrators, or whether it's violence among people in the drug trade, high-speed pursuits of somebody with marijuana. There's so much more harm has come from, for example, from that. And we see the same thing here. And, in my article, I point out, I can't remember the name of the substance, but there's already something that's even more concentrated than fentanyl.
ISO, I think it was. Okay.
Yeah. And so we see that, the same dynamic playing out. And so, just another example of one of my favorite quotes, which is, government is a disease masquerading as its own cure. I think it's Robert Lefebvre who said that.
It's a great quote.
Chat guys can check us on that. But yeah, government is a disease masquerading as its own cure, and you see that over and over again. And the war on drugs is a phenomenal example where it causes more problems than the policies actually help solve.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like about the iron law of prohibition, which I hadn't heard of before, is it encourages you to think about, which almost no one does whenever they pass a law, incentives. Everything. I'm not saying everything is economics, but everything is incentive driven. And actually, economics is a good model to look like supply and demand. They're good models to use sometimes. And if you just think for a moment about incentives, you realize like, well, yeah, if I had to be on the black market smuggling drugs, well, a little microdot that could kill 100 million people would be the best drug I could think of. Like, let's develop and transport that one so we can,
cut it up into little teeny pieces and
yeah, right. So people tend to think in a very static. I view policy analysis tends to be extremely static. This is the way things are now, and I'm going to take my magic marker and cross out the things over here by making them illegal or whatever. It's like, okay, but that's not what you're doing. You're simply distorting the dynamics, the interpersonal and economic dynamics of people's relationship, of society. And you got to ask yourself, well, what's that distortion going to do?
Right.
Well, people that might just be growing marijuana in their backyard suddenly have to maybe arm themselves, and now they've got to enforce their own laws because they can't go to the cops and say he stole my pot. Now you got to go shoot the guy yourself because he's like whatever. Like, so you've got that whole dynamic. Now you better be breeding for more potent strains because you can't just transportation costs really matter because the overhead includes all of the evasion of security. Like, all that stuff happens. Right. It's entirely predictable.
You're right.
But we just don't
and the more difficult you make to smuggle it, then on top of all that, then the price goes up, which encourages more innovation. Markets are markets. Whether it's a legit open legal market or a black market, markets are markets, and you've got it's a huge point you just made about incentives and weighing that. And there's 2 books I'd recommend people read just to kind of get your mind thinking in that way. One would be Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. And the other is Hazlitt's classic book. I just can't remember.
I don't remember Hazlitt's classic book. I don't think
Economics in One Lesson. Economics in One Lesson.
Okay.
By Hazlitt. If you read those 2 books, it's almost from an economical point of view, and they're not. I think for a lot of people, if they hear, "Oh, he wants me to read a book about economics," these books don't. It's not dense because this is real economics. It's talking about incentives and all the type of thing we're talking about here. So they're very approachable books, especially economics in One Lesson. Real easy reading, but
easier than von Mises.
Yeah, exactly. But read those books, and you almost feel like you've gone into the matrix and you understand it now, because you start thinking just exactly what you were just saying. You start understanding what incentives, the role of incentives in all of the above, in all of our interactions and all our policies. Yeah. And just to reinforce another point you made is that people always impose policies without trying to anticipate what are those follow-on incentives created by that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's very sophomore. It's really, I've always struggled with why it's such a childish way to view the world. Like, is this static like piece of paper and like here's the interactions and we're just gonna do this? It's like, what? It almost blows my mind sometimes that's the extent of people's thinking about a lot of these things. It's like, don't like that, make illegal. Like,
right, and not just people on the street. People who are in power and have authority over our lives, that type of thing. One of the quintessential examples of that type of static thinking, that to use your term, is when Congress said, "Oh, we're going to stick it to the rich." I think this is back in the early '90s. We're gonna stick it to the rich, and we're gonna put a luxury tax on yachts. Right? This darn monopoly guys with their top hats
and monocles, yachts and monocles.
We'll stick it to them. So they imposed this really hefty luxury tax on yachts. Static thinking, right? Great, we're gonna collect a lot of more of their money. Well, what happened? Wealthy people got wealthy, a lot of them, because they make judicious decisions about their money, right? So the yacht business dries up. Well, and so what happens? The guys in the construction yard are laid off.
Right.
You know,
Right.
That's
Right.
a great example though of that static thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also, I mean, we don't have to get too deep into monetary policies, but it's also one of the things that I think is one of the least noticed costs of a lot of our economic policy, which is and something that no one ever talks about when they talk about raising taxes on the rich or taxing wealth or or interest rates or anything, which is the money that people have amassed, the wealth that they have in savings accounts, or if you're wealthy, it's usually not in a savings account. It might be, even if it's liquid, it might be in a money market account briefly, but it's in stocks or whatever, but some sort of liquid asset. That money is used. It's the foundation for poorer people to borrow, not poor people necessarily, it depends on the business, but like for other people to borrow and then generate economic activity with. If you want to start a business, you need a loan, which happens all the time. Well, the availability of rich people's bank accounts is what matters to you. Like that needs to be there. If you suck that away and then pretend that there's no consequence to people who actually weren't directly affected, you're just a moron. Like, of course that it affects the entire economy. Like, Of course it does. If you take $1 trillion out of Wall Street, as much as I hate a lot of Wall Street, if you take $1 trillion out of, various funds, like that affects people's ability to, that money's not there to loan. So businesses.
I'm reminded of the picture I saw of a edgy woman in a coffee cafe with her laptop, her nice late generation Apple laptop with a sticker on it that says "Stamp out capitalism."
Yep.
Right. Right.
You're right. I mean, there's a neat on YouTube. Milton Friedman, I think he's on the Donahue show, and he's kind of addressing this question because somebody from the audience just kind of wants to put more taxes on the rich and take their money, and he just kind of helps her through the thinking. Now, what do people do? What do you think those people do with their money? Do they put it in a mattress? No, it's like you said, you're invested. And, capitalism, it's about capital. It's about money available for lending, money available for investment in launching new companies, equity, stock shares, that type of thing. That allows for the investment in plants, machinery, things that increase productivity. Increased productivity is what raises all of our standard of living by making the power of this computer and the price of it, much less than it was, 20 years ago, for example. So yeah, people just don't have that fundamental understanding of economics.
This is why I think everyone should start a company, especially a company for which you need to raise venture capital. And I hate raising venture capital, and I actually don't like starting companies like that. But you certainly you understand really quickly. Like I was an entrepreneur, and then I went into the venture capital space, and then I left the whole thing because I didn't like it. But you certainly understand at that point, like, oh, some dude with an idea needs some money. He's got to borrow it from somewhere or to get it as investment. That might be wealthy individuals. It might be venture capital, but they get their money from somewhere. Like venture capital companies get their money from somewhere. Those are larger funds. Like it all. So, when you talk about like, oh, we're only going to hit the ultra rich. It's like, okay, but that affects the dudes trying to start a little software company.
Right. Or work for that company.
Uh-huh.
Or just even have a job at that company. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's there's no empathy for the risk involved.
Right.
There's no empathy for the fact that whether it's that individual person opening the restaurant or starting some small company and putting, even if they're getting outside capital, they're probably going to start with their own money first. That type of stuff. I mean, I'm empathetically terrified on behalf of every new restaurant I see start in the neighborhood, like because I know the risk that they're taking and the survival rate, and then with those risks that they take, which ultimately benefit all of us, then there should be rewards. And I'm kind of indifferent to how big those rewards are. It's not.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a lack of appreciation. There's a you didn't build that kind of attitude.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of appreciation.
Yeah.
My wife and I have this conversation all the time because we're both entrepreneurs, and we sit down once in a while and say to ourselves, like, would we be just better off and happier if we're in Silicon Valley? We could both make, $250,000 a year, just like working for Google or whatever. And like, we'll probably have to work some overtime, it'd be a tough job maybe, but like, wouldn't that be so much easier than being the only guy, like continually be like, I'll start another company. Like I'm the guy sweeping the floor and like, or whatever it is, like constantly losing money at the beginning, risking stuff, like having all the anxiety. I mean, we both just, personally, we decided that we were both just pathological and couldn't help it. But it's not an easy thing. And people only see the successes. They only see Mark Zuckerberg after he's got 18 private jets and whatever, and then they get all indignant and upset about his wealth and blah blah blah. But they don't see the 99 or 9,999 other entrepreneurs who never got to be Mark Zuckerberg, and lost their house and got divorced and worked their ass off and failed a million times and lost their kids' college fund or whatever. Like that kind of stuff happens all the time. I don't know where I'm going with that.
No, I agree. Yeah.
All right. Let me ask you the other question, which is, is there another story that we should be paying attention to that we haven't been paying attention to?
There's a movement afoot that I wrote about last month at starkrealities.substack.com, which is about a movement to bring about a convention for the consideration of new amendments to the Constitution. And recently they hit the one of the foremost group that's pursuing this Convention of States Action. Kind of hit a milestone where they're more than halfway to having the number of states necessary on board to do this. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, constitutional amendments can originate with Congress and then be ratified by the states, and that's how all of our amendments have pretty much happened ever since the Bill of Rights. But another avenue which has never brought about an actual amendment, it's been used but not all the way to the point where it was successful, is one where the states can call for a convention, and you need 34 states to do that, and they're at 19 now. And this is the primary movement on this is led by a conservative right-wing type movement, with a focus on having a convention that they want to have confined to discussing and proposing amendments about limiting the power of the federal government, spending power, that type of thing, term limits, these types of things. They've got a little model language that the state legislatures can use to do that. So it's kind of this interesting thing that's going on. Like I said, 4 states alone just did it this year. So there's this sense of momentum behind this movement that's going on. You have to get to 34 states. Again, this is coming from the Republican side and some libertarian side. And I think the Republicans control outright 30 of the state legislatures. So if you kind of do the math, it's starting to become more and more feasible that something like this could come about. And it's very controversial even among conservatives. There's people who are absolutely adamantly opposed to this on the right wing, like the John Birch Society, that type of thing. There's people who think this would be a Pandora's box, that you wouldn't be able to confine the nature of the amendments, even though they're trying to delineate what the scope would be. This is a map inside that's in my article as well that shows you kind of the progress so far to date. The green states having gone all the way. Yep. Yellow passed in one chamber, and blue means there's people proposing or there's something on the floor of their legislature. Interesting. It's the legislatures call for these. Period. The governors have no effect. So it's not like the Colorado legislature does it and then they the governor could veto it. It's not that at all. The legislature gets to speak. They're the ones with the voice on this. So that's an interesting dynamic as well.
So I'm skeptical of it. And first of all, are you skeptical? Like, what are the pluses and minuses you see here?
I see pretty much all pluses, just about.
Okay.
I'm not. I don't think it's imminent. Like it will happen that this convention will come about anytime soon. To me, there's a number of pluses. There can be pluses even without a convention being called. If you start cresting to where you've got 30 states out of 34 that you need on board wanting to propose amendments to limit the power of the federal government, their spending, this type of stuff, you start to have this, it's like the bow wave ahead of you, effect on Washington. Where we've seen this before with other amendment drives where the mere fact that it was becoming close to becoming a reality or an amendment might be coming from the states led the national government to like maybe accommodate that a little bit. So there could be that dynamic to some extent. But if we actually get to a convention, people are very fearful of what might come out of it. Like what amendment could be created out of this process? Well, you have to have, it's hard for me to get very worried about that because so you need 34 to call the convention. Then the convention meets. They say, okay, here's our proposed amendment or set of amendments. Okay, once they do that, then it goes back to the states, and either the state legislature has to approve it, or you have a ratifying convention in each state to approve it. Either way, now you need 38. So you needed 34 to even have this convention. You need 38 to then adopt this for it to become part of the Constitution. So to me, it's the reason why that process exists. That puts a brake on extreme type proposals, right? You've got to have this pretty wide consensus among a big part of the states to get something through. So I think it's a moderating influence. If you look at one of the proposals that is at the forefront of the Convention of States action, their messaging and all that kind of stuff, it's term limits.
Yep.
Well, you pull term limits and you get amens across the political spectrum. There's actually reasons to think term limits may not be such a great idea. We could talk about that separately. But
Sure.
That's an example of the fact that, probably the most likely thing to come out of one of those conventions would probably be that, which is, seen as very popular and not extreme. There, I think there's potential drawbacks to it. But, and if you look at the other things, the Convention of States Action, they're very serious about this, very organized. They had a mock convention where they brought in people from all, representatives and did their own mock amendment convention at I think College of William and Mary last year or 2 years ago. And it was neat to see, okay, what did they come out with? What did these people end up proposing? Johnny on the spot.
Here's some stuff.
Yeah. So you see term limits, requiring a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate to increase the public debt. So a break on debt, restoring the Commerce Clause to its original intent. I mean, few things have done more destruction to the original nature of the United States of America than the Supreme Court's absolutely delusional, willfully delusional interpretation of the Commerce Clause. I mean, something it entirely didn't, and that allows the federal government to regulate, and pretty much every aspect of our life. The repeal of the income tax. That's I particularly like this next to last bullet, giving states by a 3/5 vote the power to negate any federal law.
That's an interesting one. Yeah.
So I look at this list and I get excited about, just thinking about the prospect of that, because I mean, if you look at that one particularly, you're seeing a desire to restore balance.
Wait, does this mean that any particular state could decide not to do it if 3/5 of their population, or does it mean 3/5 of the states get together
3/5
and they
of the
say
states,
we're negating this law?
Yep. So
Okay.
you have 3/5 of the states all say, hey, we don't think whatever the law might be. Yeah, we want to negate that law.
The NSA should have a budget, for example.
There you go. Exactly. 3/5 of the states think there should be no mass surveillance, no surveillance of U.S. citizens, or
Patriot Act, something like that. Yeah,
exactly, something like anything. Yeah, think about it. That's to me one of the most attractive ones, if you will, because if it addresses the total imbalance that's happened since the start of the country. The country came together the United States Constitution was formed in such a way that you had independent states, and we now think of the word state as being a political subdivision, but it's really, the term states at the time and now should mean a truly bona fide independent state, like France is a state, Delaware is a state. So you had these states coming together, and they decided to create this federal government, which had limited powers, and they were kind of creating this entity to serve them, right? To
like the EU.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to use that example,
but with limits, but with limits, yeah.
Sure.
So where the states have sovereignty, the 10th Amendment says that any power not given to the federal government is then assumed to be, the purview of the individual states or the people. There's no basis the great majority of what the federal government does, there's no constitutional basis for it. And so this kind of restores that to give the states, a check on what exactly the federal government's doing. Kind of a veto power, if you will, over what that, because that federal entity is supposed to be really subservient in a way to the states. That it's there to perform certain functions for all the mutual benefit of them, but not to be this colossal entity that, through the Commerce Clause interpretations and other things, controls so many aspects of our lives that the framers would. It's a federal law. I saw this recently. It's a federal law for a cherry pie more than 4 inches in diameter to be called a tart. That's a federal law. Run that. Tell that to Madison.
But you can call Kardashians tarts, right? That's still okay. I just wanted. Sorry. All right.
That's kind of one of my favorite examples, though. Tell James Madison that's what the federal government's involving themselves in when they're just supposed to be.
What the Commerce Clause meant was tart regulation.
Right. And the government gets to control how much food you grow on your own land. That's one of the early Supreme Court cases that drove us to where we are now. Yeah.
So, okay. I like the idea. So one thing I like is this idea of more ways in which we can ignore federal laws. So that's a good thing. So giving more avenues for that is great. I do share a little bit of I guess you said it was the John Birch Society that was worried about this, but I do share some concern that we are in a political environment now in which very few people are, a relatively small number of the population is actually adamantly wanting states' rights. Most of the population is trying to fight over the gun in the room in Washington so they can point it at everyone else. And so, calling together a convention, my concern is it turns into a brawl over who points the gun at whom, not a conversation of like, let's stop pointing, let's give power back to the states, but like, hey, what can we do? Right. And things like the Second Amendment, just as an example, and I know you brought this up in your article, but the Second Amendment, as much as the left will say it's not clear about this and it doesn't mean that and blah, 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 it's one of the most clearly written and powerful amendments. It's more powerful than the first. The first says Congress shall make no law. The second one says shall not be infringed. It's stronger. It's very, very clear. The only thing that muddies the waters is the first clause, which is irrelevant in terms of effect, because it's an explanation. This thing being true, here's the rule. That whatever the thing is, the rule doesn't change, but okay. Right. And it's misinterpreted, but it's one of the clearest ones. I find it hard to believe that a group of states would get together and if they were going to touch that, they couldn't make it better, really. Right. That's basically impossible. And I do see a lot of even conservative states. There's a lot of this Aristotelian mean fallacy, this golden mean fallacy of like, well, let's compromise. What if the Second Amendment says you can't have automatic weapons, but let's rewrite it so that to make it clear that you can hunt. It's like I don't want it to be clear that you can hunt. That's not what it says. Right. And I think a lot of the red states, I don't trust the red states to be principled. It's a very principled amendment, and that's just one of them. Right. It's a very principled amendment. And I find it hard to believe that anything that a convention would come up would be principled in any way.
Right. Well, first of all, the convention would not be compelled to create any amendment. It's a convention to propose them. So the more it turns into a rock fight in there, well, then the less chance that anything's going to come out of it. So, but I mean, I can see your point. And while I said I kind of go like this at the list, I do.
Sure.
I try to keep my eyes open to like you on what could go wrong here. So I mean, if you had that convention right after a dreadful gun shooting, for example, what could happen?
I'm not saying could be orchestrated by certain members of the deep state, but could be.
Some might say that.
Hey, what great timing!
But if it did happen in the wake of something like that. Yeah, you could see that. But then, of course, it goes out to 38 states approval. But yeah, so there is a bit of a Pandora's box possibility on some of these things. At the same time, I think sometimes, what's the worst case scenario? Some really terrible amendment comes out of there that some states are just absolutely adamant against, but somehow it makes it through the process. Well, then to me, that might just incentivize secessions, which
maybe
I think could be a good thing.
Yeah, well, I'm with you on that.
Right. So if you look at that kind of worst case scenario, then maybe it actually helps accelerate a right sizing of the union. Or
that's a good point. That's a I'll
I guess
that's a good point.
And I'm so fatalistic about the trajectory of the country from a liberties point of view and an economics point of view and the financials of the federal government and the dollar and so forth, that it's almost like a what have we got to lose kind of thing when I look at the possibility of a constitutional convention. And some people would say quite a bit depending on the way it plays out. Maybe you're not seceded and you've got a even more muscular government somehow coming out of it. Doesn't seem like that would be the case when the driving force, if this convention happened, would be 34 states who want to limit the federal government. But I mentioned that the most powerful movement right now is led by Republicans, conservatives. There have been movements from all stripes. What's his name? I don't know how to pronounce his last name. From the Young Turks. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think he created a PAC and everything to try to counteract the Citizens United decision, and call a constitutional convention about campaign finance and that type of thing. He's nowhere near the progress of this other group, but the point being, it's not solely a conservative idea. I mean,
sure.
If you think about this, this was a mechanism that the founders created very deliberately. Mm-hmm. For the very reasons that we're talking about, to give the states some power to assert themselves if the federal government's gone wrong, or if they realize, hey, the Constitution, we need to edit this thing, or that type of thing, and never been used, a couple hundred years. So people, it's not like we found some rusty hypodermic needle. And we want to use it. It's like this is a legitimate tool that the founders, I think, wisely created, and we shouldn't necessarily shy away from it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm always impressed by things like this, where they created this new thing. It had really just never been tried before. They're like, we're going for it. And they still were able to foresee problems that are popping up hundreds of years later. I mean, we've never had to call a convention of the states, but we're approaching a place where I think, it's fair to say that there are large, I mean, maybe the majority of the population is not entirely happy with the way things are going
Right.
in DC, and we really don't have any other way to stop them. I mean, sure, voting, if they don't pass a bunch of laws we hate before the next election cycle, so just having this is kind of a balance on the federal government going wild, which we're seeing. But it's funny that this got brought up because I just recently even heard of this, and I thought it was really interesting, and that they have 19 states. That's not bad. I mean, it's something. So I was looking it up and I Googled it because I used the wrong browser. So I used Google actually to look it up. And the first result
Carter is not pleased.
Google was like, no such thing exists, Juliet.
Right. So it takes me to this website called commoncause.org, and it's an anti-Article 5 convention group. And I mean, they're, totally hysterical about it. But
Right.
I was like, that's very interesting that there's already an organization to counter something no one's ever heard of. And I went and looked into the funding. Guess who the number one funder is for this?
The
George
Atlantic
Soros.
Council. Oh, George Soros. There
I
we
was
go.
going to guess Soros.
Yeah,
I was going to guess
better.
Soros.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll give you
Yeah.
credit for your I was going to guess, Carter.
Yeah. No, I was going to say Soros.
I believe
and
you. You're
Gates was going
credible.
to be my number 2.
Yeah.
But
that's funny.
yeah, I mean,
He's looking out there.
Yeah, he just cares. That's all it is he cares about us. I also have a largely fatalistic view of the current configuration of America. So there is some sense of like, well, let's mix it up, I guess, and see what happens. We have a show that's almost every week, I guess every week on Wednesday, called Rebel Civics. And the guy who hosts that show on Unsafe Space used to be part of the Convention of States, used to be part of that that movement, and I think did a bunch of stuff for them. And my cynicism, I'm trying not to be too much of a Debbie Downer, but part of my cynicism here is no one is as principled as they were in 1776 or in the 1780s. Like the idea that people would say the things that people like Madison or Jefferson said and have the kind of debate, like read the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers. The idea that would be a discussion that we could even possibly have today is just ridiculous. It wouldn't happen. So the population, especially the people who would be having this discussion, are starting from a starting point that's just already compromised. And the Commerce Clause is one of these interesting things to me, because one of my catchphrases that I've been saying for years is like, they'll let you have the Constitution if they can have the dictionary. And like the Commerce Clause, I mean, well, we talked about the Second Amendment. We can also apply this to the Commerce Clause. It means whatever they want it to mean if they rewrite what words mean and interpret things however they want. And so how do you strengthen a document? Is just a piece of paper. How do you stop the federal government from doing things when you write shall not be infringed, they're not sure what that means? Or when you write the Commerce Clause, they're like, oh, that means that I can regulate the size of cherry tarts. Like, what? Like, if that's what's going on, we're living in such a bizarro world. It's like Salvador Dali version of justice, that of constitutional review, that like, well,
right.
What could you possibly do at this point? I mean, and I don't know, maybe the answer is let's bring it to a head and separate somehow, and maybe this is a way to bring it to a head. But that's kind of my frustration with all of this. And I think like people that invest a lot of energy and like, oh well, we'll change the process through this thing. I'm like, guys, look around, look at your neighbors. That's not going to happen. Am I just too down? Am I too much of a Debbie Downer? I don't know.
I believe I share deep fatalism and skepticism about everything. But I guess I don't, I guess I applaud their effort.
Yeah.
That
I'm the same way. Yeah.
like that nothing, to me, only good can come out of it. Like I said, if you have this rising tide of explicitly expressed state legislator discontent with the federal government to the point of, hey, we may start change your rule book up there on Capitol Hill, might you have some effect on that? Or just the drive itself has a sort of civics lesson for all of us. And I don't mean about the mechanics of the Constitution, but just kind of driving conversations about, hey, maybe the state should have more say over, or veto power over federal law, this type of thing. I mean, like Juliet pointed out, people howl at that idea. For them, the idea of any state autonomy, they immediately go to the Civil War. It's
right, right. Yeah, and you can't force people to use the right pronouns if it doesn't come from Washington or whatever. Like if you've got an agenda, it's like, well, it's much easier if you want to force your way on other people from the left or the right. It's much easier if there's only one giant gun and that's what you have to argue over who controls that, than like there's 50 little jurisdictions and I got to fight that battle everywhere, because it's going to be, you might convince the people of Louisiana, but California or Alabama or Colorado or Idaho might be different. And hey, if you can just convince DC, you don't have to give a crap about any of those other people.
And of course, with abortion, we recently saw, kind of the opposite dynamic where it is devolved down to the decision making on that issue is sent to the states, for them to decide. Which you had people, the pro-choice people saying, "Wow, we shouldn't have." 6 people in robes in Washington decide this, unelected people. Well, then they weren't deciding. It originally was decided in the fashion you're talking about.
They said we're not going to decide it.
They're actually democratizing it by sending it out to the states for that decision.
Right. Yeah.
No matter how you feel about the issue, it's giving more authority to the state. We recently saw a Kansas referendum, on this, where the pro-life forces prevailed. In retaining whatever permissions they had there in Kansas on this issue. And I saw a New York Times columnist, I think it was, characterize it as in a repudiation of the Supreme Court, Kansas voters. It was not a repudiation. The Supreme Court said it's Kansas's choice. That's what they said. So it's not repudiating. It's kind of just letting it be seen in action, what they were saying. So.
Yeah, it's amazing how "it's up to you" is interpreted so horrifically.
Yes.
Like, what do you mean it's up to us? How dare you? Like, what are you talking about? if you want a law, go pass it. Yeah. I admire the founding fathers quite a lot. And I like Juliet, like you said, they planned for so many things. But I will say, if I had a time machine and I could go whisper in Jefferson's ear, I would say, you need to make it way, way easier to veto, repeal, refuse to just ignore legislation. You need to make it like, a state can voluntarily opt out of any, you just need to make it super easy so people can say, nope, hey, that whole thing that you're doing, we're not part of it. It's not a saying no should not be passing new legislation should be really hard. And saying no to laws should be super easy. It should be just trivially easy, because no state's going to say, oh, we want murder. That's just not going to happen. You don't have to worry about that happening. Right. So what you need to worry about is the government growing, and you need to be states to be able to say, no, we're not doing that. That TSA thing you guys are doing. No, we're not part of that. That Patriot Act thing. No. NSA, leave. We're not doing that. That's not our state. We're not doing that.
I like that. I wish we could.
Judson Pinson in chat says, "It's up to you" equals fascism. Yes, that's what we got told.
Might as well.
We missed a super chat earlier that I just want to. I don't think I can throw it up on screen anymore, but I have it here. G-Man says we have our annual government ethics training soon. We're supposed to report waste, fraud, and corruption, but I don't have time to report all that. I think you can just submit their budget back to them. That's the best way to do it. It's just hand them just ask for a copy of the budget and then stick it in an envelope and mail it back. Here's my report.
All of the above.
Yeah, all of the above. All right, Brian, any final, or Juliet, any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with?
Ladies first.
Gosh, I don't know. Just question everything all the time. I've had like a hit your head against the wall kind of moment yesterday, talking to a friend and realizing that like she sees through certain things, and then other things it's like, oh, I mean, what we were saying earlier, like, oh, of course they're telling the truth this time.
Right.
Question everything all the time. That's
right.
all I can say.
What's that? Is it man, I forget the name of that rule, but it's that if there's someone's law, it's someone's
Gresham's law. Occam's razor.
No, the one where you read a piece of news that you know about, and you're like, oh, this is completely wrong, and then you flip the page and you assume that the next piece of news that you don't know anything about is like accurate reporting. There's some I forget the name of that law, but there's this like this, when you. I think a lot of us have experienced that, where you read something that it's Knowles' law. Beverly says it's Knowles' law. Okay. I don't know, but I'm reminded of that when you're talking about your friend, Juliet. It's like, oh, I happen to know this issue really well, and everything they're saying is completely wrong. And I don't know this issue, so I assume everything they're saying is completely right.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Brian, it's to the man now. We're done with the ladies.
Time for man talk. Let me mansplain something,
yeah,
Juliet.
Mansplain to the audience.
No, I guess I have an auxiliary law kind of thing, which is that every statement the federal government makes about foreign policy or national security should be considered false unless you actually are given proof that it's true. Like there should be no presumption whatsoever that any single thing they say. I mean, I could probably apply to beyond just foreign policy and national security, but I think especially there that the presumption is that it's false. And I don't know who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, but that'd be a whole other discussion. But
probably not Russia, if that's what they're saying.
But to just assume that the intelligence community says this has all the hallmarks of Russia, like I don't know. I mean, I don't know what kind of 4D chess could be going on out there, but to me, the pipeline was their source of leverage, right?
Right.
Yeah,
like,
I don't understand.
Pull down the sanctions regime, and hey, maybe the gas will flow again. I mean, the person who blew it up would seem to me to be saying, hey, let's take game 3. Let's take that card off the table. Let's just take that piece out completely. So that's it. I don't know who blew it up, but to leap to the assumption that Russia would have done that seems kind of silly. So
I think it's
take
like
John Brennan's conclusions with the deep skepticism, and know that he is has a checkered past as far as telling the truth.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone has an incentive, it's probably the 3-letter agencies in the U.S. that we're talking about, like that,
Right. Or I don't know if Ukraine could have pulled that mission off by themselves, or outsource it to somebody, some other nefarious country. Same thing. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what's a whole nother topic, but yeah, it was just a really disturbing escalation. If we start putting pipelines and what could be next, tit for tat, and out goes a internet cable or phone cable that's under the ocean, or this types of things, or other pipelines. Yeah, not good times for we're in right now.
Well, it's a good what do we call it? The McGlinchey law? That's
right. Absolutely.
All right. It's a good law to remember. So
in self-aggrandizing fashion, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fine. It reminds me of the one that's basically the title of the legislation is the opposite of what will happen.
That's right.
Right? Like
the Patriot Act, or
yeah, it's about
or these laws America. That I can't remember what the names are, but they've been like about we're going to free up the internet. It's about
right,
how they regulate the internet. Yeah.
Net neutrality means not neutral. Inflation Reduction Act means more inflation. Yeah. That's unfortunately, I think that's par for the course. So, Brian, I know you're not on social, but you do have a Substack. So remind people how they can find you and follow your work.
Yes, I eschew social media because I've seen its power to suppress independent journalists like me. So just go straight to the source. That's the beauty of the new Substack model, is you don't have to follow a journalist and then hope that Twitter or Facebook or whoever actually lets you then see their posts. Just go to starkrealities.substack.com, starkrealities.substack.com. I publish at least once a calendar month. My tagline is invigoratingly unorthodox perspectives for intellectually honest readers. So that kind of gives you an idea of what I'm trying to do and kind of shake people's maybe foundational beliefs or things that they've been led to believe about things, or let them think about things in a different way. I take satisfaction in alternatingly irritating the conventional left and conventional right who loved my last article, but then they hate my next headline. Hopefully they keep reading. But just go there, sign up. You can sign up for free for the content. You'll get an email directly to your inbox without the approval stamp of Mark Zuckerberg, right straight to it. If you want to become a supporting subscriber, that's great too. But otherwise, feel free to just sign up and join me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate your time.
And, I really enjoyed the discussion here.
We'll have you back.
A lot of fun.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for sticking around until the end. If you're new to Unsafe Space, check out our deep content library that includes discussions with everyone from James Lindsay to Brett Weinstein. And please consider helping to fund our work by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on a variety of social media platforms, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space Discord server, which is open to financial supporters at any level. We hope to see you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. It would be better for your health if you forgot what you just heard. That should be easy for someone of your intelligence. The following co-conspirators are hereby ordered to watch CNN. Experts agree that 87,000 new tax collectors will make inflation feel like less of a problem. I think we can agree that the FBI's track record speaks for itself. If you think about it, only government-sanctioned experts should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.